Today's topic will be stress in the circadian system, and I will be talking about some molecular mechanisms of the central circadian system, circadian microphysiology, and then stress-related sleep and circadian disruption in the paradigm of one stress-associated disorder, PTSD, and I'll try to conclude with some implications for treatment and future directions. I would like to start with Plato. He said that time depends on the periodic regularity of movement, which is defined and secured by the planets. And if you think, we still count time based on planet movement. We have 1 year, an Earth rotation around the Sun. We have the lunar cycle, which gives us approximately a month. But perhaps the most important planet movement that affects us is the constant rotation of Earth around its own axis, which bounds us to this constant change of light and darkness. We spend half our lives in darkness, half our lives in light, and our body has to adapt. So chronobiology is gathers all research concerning temporal organization of physiologic processes, but also pathophysiologic processes. And perhaps the father of modern chronobiology is considered Jürgen Aschoff, who did first experiments with healthy humans. He took them to a bunker in Bavaria, in Mount Index, and he just saw that specific circadian changes kept on despite the fact that there was no light. So how does it function and what does it tell us? The way the certain circadian system works is that we have the input of light which goes to the retina, and we have two different kinds of senses. We have the visual perception and the photoperception. The photoperception is done by the retinal ganglion cells, and this photic signal goes through the retinal thalamic tract to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the major clock. This is the central clock. How important the suprachiasmatic nucleus is, you can see it here on the left of the slide. It's what happens if we don't have the retinal ganglion cells or if we don't have the optic tract. Not much. But if you take out the suprachiasmatic nucleus, then you have a total breakdown in circadian organization. With a seminal paper about '84, I think, published in Cell, it was the first hint that this circadian rhythm provided by the SCN lies on gene transcription. And here you see on the bottom of the page the loop between gene expression, protein, and inhibition. And on the top, on the down right side, you can see what it looks like. This is a suprachiasmatic nucleus. And you see that all cells align. They work together and they have the same intrinsic activity. So the main circadian system affects mainly the hypothalamus. And in the hypothalamus, we have different very important systems. We have the arousal system, which has major implications for sleep. We have the HPA axis, and we have also the peripheral limb of the autonomic nervous system. They all adapt to this circadian activity. But we also have other circadian changes. Almost half of our genes show circadian patterns, you see on the right side. And what you see here are fibroblasts. Now, fibroblasts do not have this intrinsic activity, so their activation is based on signals from the central circadian clock. This works like this. We have the major clock, and then we have the efferents, the melatonin and cortisol signals, which is actually the two hormones that say to our body what time it is. And this signal orchestrates all peripheral circadian rhythms to a harmonic and healthy circadian rhythm, the 24-hour rhythm that we live in. So the SCN is very important for almost all actions in our body. And here you see some wonderful rhythms. Almost everything has a rhythm in our body. You see the core body temperature, melatonin, cortisol, and almost every hormone has its own peak during the 24 hours. A special relationship is between melatonin and cortisol. And you can just remember that when melatonin rises, cortisol drops down, and vice versa. You can see it, almost best thing is to see it in the morning, where the cortisol rise makes melatonin drop down. And the ankle phase between these two hormones has been suggested as an important parameter in stress research. What happens in the periphery, we also have circadian rhythms. We have circadian rhythms, for example, in the acetylation of the glucocorticoid receptor, which means that also the sensitivity, the tissue sensitivity on glucocorticoids depends on the hour of the day. The same thing for immune cells. Almost every immune cell has its own circadian rhythm. Our concentration, cognitive performance, affect, and physical performance as well. So we are really bound to this internal clock, and we're different being in the morning and in the evening. We're the same persons, but we function differently at 11 a.m. or in 11 p.m. We even give birth or die according to the clock, and it's very interestingly, we die when cortisol peaks. Remember that. What happens when the circadian alignment is disrupted? And I would like to quote Chateaubriand, who said, "It is not man who stops time, it is time that stops men." And if our circadian system, our time holder, breaks down, then we are stopped. We're not healthy anymore. This is a slide scored by physics. You can see the normal amplitude and phase in circadian oscillations. And this is exactly what also happens when our circadian oscillations get dysregulated. On the left, you can see what happens when we have a reversible dysregulation. It comes back to normal. But if we have toxic stress or we have chronic stress, this might lead to a chronic dysregulation. This is just an example. This is a pathologic picture of our Earth on the left, and you can imagine that this is not normal. And on the bottom, you can see what happened after massive electrification with the reproductive cycle of manhood. These are the effects that Thomas Edison caused us. Traumatic stress. This is a major factor concerning circadian rhythm alignment. And just two animal studies that really show that acute stress can lead to a chronic dysregulation in sleep, as shown in this study, or also in the circadian expression of clock genes in the basolateral amygdala. What about PTSD? I told you that I would like to concentrate on PTSD because it is one very specific stress disorder. In the definition of PTSD, we failed to also include sleep disturbances as one main criterion. And you can see that almost 50 to 90% of people with PTSD have sleep disturbance. Most likely is the fragmental REM sleep or higher REM latency, and I will come back to this later. Only in the last 2 or 3 years, people have concentrated on treating sleep problems in PTSD. This is an advertisement by the VA. PTSD, stress disorder might lead to circadian dysregulation. This is the hypothesis, and these are some facts. On the left-hand side, you can see a dysregulated nocturnal drop on heart rate and heart rate variability. That means that people with PTSD have blunted drop. The same happens with IL-6 peripheral rhythm, which actually has a beautiful biphasic rhythm. In PTSD patients, this is blunted. The melatonin rise is shifted. Also, there are many studies on cortisol in PTSD. Some showed higher levels, lower levels. It's not really conclusive, but what is conclusive is that we have a blunting in the diurnal rhythm, for example, in the awakening response. By the way, the single gene that has been identified by a GWAS study in PTSD is RORA gene. This is a clock gene involved in central circadian regulation. And this is still not published. It was a poster in the last biological psychiatry meeting. This is very interesting because it shows that it is possible that genotype of clock genes might influence the risk of developing PTSD after trauma. That means that the genotype of our clock system might be a central, might play a central role in the development. Also, the timing of stress is very important. We know that stress during night in humans or vice versa in rats might lead to a much higher risk of developing PTSD than if we had a stressor at 8 a.m. after we wake up. And why is that? Because the most important structures like the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala, they work in a circadian manner. And the memory consolidation, which is very important in PTSD, this is secured by the REM sleep phase, which is disrupted when we have a sleep disruption after stress. So this might be a model of PTSD. If we have a trauma on the right-hand side, we can have a resolved acute response with a regulation of circadian system and then not developing PTSD, or we could have a chronic insomnia that might lead to a loop and to persistent PTSD symptoms. And we also know that patients that have sleep disturbances in before stress exposure have 2.5 to 3 times higher risk of developing PTSD. That means that circadian dysregulation also before trauma could be a risk factor. Very briefly, some further pathophysiological mechanisms might be involved. The first is sex. We heard about gender differences, and we know that there are gender differences with respect to the circadian system in men, in humans. Here you see that women sleep less. This is written in the genes, and this is also written in different amplitudes of rhythmic clock gene expression in the most main parts of our brain. TBI, traumatic brain injury, we know that this is a risk factor for PTSD, and we also know that this causes circadian dysregulation. And this is also a very severe risk factor also for the development of dementia, which is also linked to the circadian system. The serotonin transporter genotype, you've all seen studies on risk of developing depression or stress-associated disorders. This also shows differences with respect to the genotype and circadian regulation or the period of oscillations. And this is what led to a theory that PTSD, this is a stress disorder, but might as well be a chronobiologic disorder a circadian disorder. And I would like to show you this wonderful painting by Salvador Dali. It's called The Persistence of Memory. And this is exactly the case in PTSD. In PTSD, you either have melted clocks that lead to the persistence of traumatic memory, or you have the traumatic memory that leads to the persistence, to the circadian dysregulation in the melted clocks. And just give it a thought, all these bubbles that you see here, HPA axis dysregulation, autonomic nervous system imbalance, glucocorticoid signal alterations, oxidative stress, etc. They're all seen in sleep disorders, circadian dysregulation, and PTSD. There should be a case. And if I have another minute, I would like to give you some ideas on possible chronobiologic treatment implications in PTSD. We have a dysfunction in the circadian system, but we also may use the circadian system to treat. This is a study conducted in rats, and this will be applied to humans as well. Sleep deprivation after trauma, the golden hours after trauma, if people or if rats stay awake, then we have a prevention of disease development. The same thing if we use melatonergic treatment after trauma. Sleep disruption or sleep alignment through melatonin, both can lead to a lower risk of developing PTSD. By the way, the number one drug we use to treat PTSD, the SSRIs, they also act through the circadian clock, and they modulate phase advances of the SCN neural finding and serotonin enhancement of circadian responses to light. So we don't really know what SSRIs do at the end, but this might be also a case. What we could do to prevent or treat: primary prevention, sleep hygiene, melatonin agents, sleep aids, avoid sleep or circadian dysregulation before exposure. For example, in military personnel, we all know their sleep is not okay because they're deployed, living under difficult situations. There we can act. We could intervene in the golden hours with sleep deprivation, perhaps corticosteroids. There are some studies on this, and melatonin. And when we treat, we should consider also chronobiologic agents like melatonin, SSRIs, or CBT for sleep disorders. And I would like to close with Euripides, time offers all answers. And I would like to invite you, if you like, to submit a paper. We have a special issue coming out in Brain Sciences on neurobiological trajectories of psychological trauma. Please feel welcome to submit. We will be gentle. Thank you for your attention.